YouTube. The Morning Phillips series, originally hosted at the Garage Co-working Space in Rapid City, South Dakota, was created to discuss philanthropy, civil society, and community. It is an opportunity to have a conversation with good people doing good things creatively and collaboratively. The format is a conversation, not a presentation, 2 tables, 2 chairs, 2 computers, and a community of interested people. Today, we are pleased to have with us a world traveler, community facilitator, and leader. A special thanks to the Bush Foundation, the Numad Group, Rural Philanthropy Institute, and the Garage for hosting today's conversation. Thanks to all those who have joined us for over 70 previous conversations. Now, with all that, we are pleased to welcome Dennis Lauer, the first CEO and president of the Cortex Innovation Community in St. Louis, Missouri. Dennis, thanks for taking time to join
Happy
us
to be
today.
here. And hello, everybody. I can't see, but I trust you're there.
They are, and we know that people are looking forward to viewing this when it's posted later as well. So what if we just jump in? And to start us off, because everybody's not familiar with St. Louis and the Cortex Innovation Community, would you give a brief overview of what Cortex Innovation Community is, and then maybe just what the Community Innovation District or communities have been historically?
Mm-hmm. So Cortex, which now we have rebranded as the Cortex Innovation Community, is a 200-acre development that's in the middle of several neighborhoods and sandwiched between 2 large academic institutions and the largest healthcare provider in the 2-state area. And those 3 plus a 4th academic institution are the founders of Cortex. And this was an old industrial neighborhood sandwiched between 2 residential neighborhoods and the universities. And it was 3rd and 4th generation uses, a lot of abandoned property, infrastructure was in disrepair. So it was seen as an interstitial space for redevelopment opportunity. The universities and other civic leaders came together specifically to leverage the research that was coming out of the academic institutions and also out of the corporate community broadly in the region in order to capture that and grow that here in St. Louis, and not just license that technology out and not capture the economic benefit. So this being a big ag location here in the middle of the country, the analogy is, you have your seed corn, but then you sell it to somebody else to grow and harvest. So the whole idea was, let's grow that here. So that 200 acres was then established as we call it now, an innovation district. And that's what's in the last 10 years, that terminology has emerged. Prior to that, they used to be called just science parks, but most science parks are suburban. The innovation district movement, as it's now branded, is more urban. It's as a result, more complex, requires more collaboration. You have more property owners, all those kinds of things. So that 200 acres within that, the focus is to develop technology-related industries, and with a focus in our case on startups as well as established companies. And across the country and around the world, communities are looking at trying to establish these districts, and each one is different. There's no 2 that are alike. And they all are trying to focus on assets, leveraging their assets, and trying to create a community consensus and governance structure to advance those assets and to make them productive, to introduce new jobs that are technology related into the economy, local economy.
So it sounds like a pretty easy thing to do. You have an idea, you want to have startups.
Oh, yeah.
You got some universities,
like
and it gives them some incentives out there, right? And then people come.
Exactly. That's exactly how it happens.
It,
And I think, unfortunately, that's what a lot of communities think. The biggest mistake that is made is that these, you have reference points when it comes to real estate. And the biggest reference point that most communities approach this from is that of a business park. And a business park is not an innovation district. And let me just sharpen that up a little bit for a moment.
please.
Business parks are great. They're a great tool that have been used over the last 30, 40 years, 50 years in this country, and they're very successful. But and most of them, business parks, again, are more suburban. And when you try to bring a business park and a sea of parking, typically green fields, etc., one developer that takes the land down, builds the buildings, etc. But when you take that model and you put it into an urban area, you can see the problems that you have with multiple property owners. The biggest differentiation between a business park and an innovation district, the way I think of it, is vertical and horizontal. In business parks, you're building individual buildings, kind of vertical buildings, multi-story buildings, usually for one, maximum two companies. And those companies stay to themselves inside those buildings. You drive in, you park, you go in, you do your work. Oftentimes, there will be small fitness centers, or there'll be food canteens inside, for breaks, that sort of thing. Even some have daycare. But then at the end of the day, you get back in your car and you leave. So it's a vertical relationship within that building. It's not horizontal. People in a business park don't necessarily relate to each other. Whereas in an innovation district, it's all about horizontal. That doesn't mean you don't have multi-story buildings. You do. The more successful innovation districts are those that have multi-tenant buildings, and also then have placemaking around those buildings and within those buildings where people can come out of their offices and interact. So it's all about facilitating these interactions in a horizontal way. And we call that, serendipitous collisions between people. And the younger workforce that's coming through right now enjoys that engagement. It's very important. And larger established corporations recognize that they also need to engage this model a lot more, because the work culture is changing, and what the employees value is changing. So these urban innovation districts really try to facilitate programmatically these interactions, horizontal interactions.
Dennis, will you take us back to 2010? And you were the
So let me
yes.
just recognize that all that was a preamble to getting around to answering your question, which is, this is easy to do. So you can see, from what I've described, that it's not easy to do. And the biggest mistake that's made is that people think, okay, here's a piece of land in an urban area. It's really a real estate development play. And so you just get some developers, they'll come in, they'll build the buildings. Of course, they have tenants in their back pockets. They can bring those to the table. And then you're done. So kind of set it and forget it. But it doesn't work that way. And Cortex, in its first 8 years, it's now 20 years old, in its first 8 years, had that business model, and it did not work. Over 8 years, there were only 2 buildings that got built, and there was no interaction. There was no placemaking. In that 200 acres, it was 2 blocks next to each other, 2 small blocks next to each other, but the rest of it was vacant. And so we pivoted that model in 2010 to really focus on placemaking, program, startups, and create an environment that would foster and facilitate and be magnetic to attracting companies. And over a period of 10 years, that became very successful.
Dennis, how did you because you joined in 2010. You were the first CEO president brought in and recruited away. You weren't looking for another position, to my knowledge, and you came in and you presented this idea, and then they recruited you to take
Yeah.
the job.
Yeah.
How did you know this was going to work? How did you know, and how did you get the buy-in that programs and other things than real estate offerings would be the reason why how this could grow and be successful? Because that seems to me to be a magnificent shift from we can see a tangible building, we can all get rallied behind it, we can all say we've done good job and pat ourselves on the back, and then to shift to we need to do programming, offer other things because every other innovation district or economic development effort is offering real estate. I'm taking you stealing that from you. I think you've shared that a couple times in the past. How'd you get people to get behind your philosophy, and then
Mhm.
where did that come from? Where did that understanding come from, Dennis? That you had that this is what St. Louis needed to do, resulting in an area that has a $2 billion economic output for St. Louis now.
Yeah. A lot to unpack there. I'm reminded of a friend of mine in college. He was a poet. At least I think him as a poet. He wrote a lot of good poetry, and one of his poems was striking matches in the dark until one of them lights,
Mm,
and that stuck with me. You know,
mm,
um, and for in my own journey, it's been about lifting up people, lifting up community, um, creating environments for people to be able to fulfill their own dreams and visions, striking matches in the dark until they light, giving people the opportunity. So how did I know this? How did I know this was going to work? Well, the reason why I accepted the job is that it was my third innovation district. All of them primarily initiated by academic institutions that recognize that if they could commercialize their research, it would be economically beneficial to the regions they were in. But in both the first and the second instances in New Jersey and in Louisiana, um, there were elements that were kind of out of focus, and it was difficult to get them in focus. People were at the table, but some of them were at the table for the wrong reasons. They were at the table to protect their own turf. And it was difficult to get them to focus together to go in one direction. And so that was one thing that when I looked at St. Louis and the people that were at the table, that was very different. And so, you can strike matches in the dark until they light, or you can say, I got to change this and go outside and see the light. Okay. So what I recognized was that the convening group of people were on the same page. They were community leaders. They were committed to the enterprise. So that was the first thing that I recognized. The other thing that I recognized is the asset base that St. Louis had, which the other two had assets, but because they weren't on the same page, it was hard to leverage those assets. People were wanting to sort of develop them a little bit on their own. And here in St. Louis, when I came to talk with them about, you got to change this real estate model because everybody's got real estate. What's new? Okay.
mm-hmm.
What's different about you? And you have to tell your story and daylight those assets, daylight what you're about, daylight the support you can give to become a magnet to attract people. So it's a value proposition issue. And every innovation district needs to have its own value proposition. And I recognize that, hey, if we sharpen this value proposition. There's a lot of pieces on the table. They just need to be orchestrated and brought together. The good thing was that after 8 years of trying, these civic leaders and presidents of these institutions said there's got to be a better way of doing this. So they were open to new ideas. So they gave me more than enough rope to hang myself. Okay. And we began to see some good results early on, but I still had to set the table. I had to set the table with the community because the community engagement wasn't what it should have been in terms of the minority community. So we had to really get that relationship right. Had to set the table in developing more collaboration with other people in the community to bring their assets to the table as well, so that wasn't just the academic institutions. And we had to focus on startups, which was a bit of a pivot for them, ironically, because their focus was let's just recruit established companies. Again, everybody under the sun, every city wants to do that. Hey, open up an innovation district, have a developer build a building, and let them go and recruit in from Silicon Valley XYZ company. Well, it doesn't work that way. So I saw that the pieces were there, and I saw that they just need some orchestration, and that they needed someone to help facilitate the dynamics that were there. I also recognized from my first two innovation districts that it's a heavy lift with the programming. And if you have to do it all yourself, it's very difficult. And what I saw when I looked at St. Louis and talked with them is that I saw that there were other players beginning to emerge in the ecosystem that could play a role in Cortex, so that we didn't have to do it ourselves alone. Some things we had to do ourselves, but other things we invited other groups in to put on programming. And then my role was really to orchestrate all that. So that's kind of how it happened.
Dennis, thanks for sharing. And I'm curious, and I'm going to say it this way, but I want to say what was an early win. And I don't mean that, I mean when. What was an early indicator to you that your philosophy or approach was sticking, was being received from those that you knew needed to receive it? That startup community, how did you know it was attracting the people that you knew were needed to create a successful innovation district early on? Like, how did you, and then I guess
I'd like to say that I had all the answers and I knew it was going to be successful, but I can't do that. And I encourage new districts that want to go down this path to recognize that you've got to think and act like an entrepreneur. You don't know if it's going to be successful necessarily. Just because you have assets doesn't mean you can assemble those assets and people will come. So I didn't know for sure that it was going to work. All that I know is that there were players in the orchestra that were walking around the stage and some in the audience, and we had to get them together and start playing from the same sheet music and see what music we would make. So I mentioned that the board had gotten to a place where there was, hey, there's got to be a better way. So they were open to new ideas, but it took 2 years, 3 years, probably close to 3 years to demonstrate the new way. In the meantime, they had to risk it with me. And one of the first things that I did that they felt really could be beneficial, and I felt could be too, but it was untested, we didn't know it, was I brought in a developer who focuses just on developing innovation-related districts, Wexford Science and Technology out of Baltimore, someone that I had known from my previous engagements. They started in Philadelphia, and The Philadelphia Science Center is one of the projects that they're engaged in heavily, have a number of products there in that center. But I brought them in. So I brought somebody who understood from the beginning that this horizontal stuff that I was talking about, placemaking and the importance of placemaking, of creating an environment that would be attractive and magnetic. So I got them to come in. We focused on, one large building in the center. We created a core. We created a new master plan with them. They helped fund it. We did a 50-50 on the new master plan, which was mixed use. The previous master plan was just technology buildings. It was a business park. So I convinced the board we need a new business plan. It needs to be mixed use. Not everybody on the board agreed with that, but give me the rope.
Uh-huh.
I hang myself. Okay. And then the second thing, so that was very, very important. And the second thing was I was able to recruit from Boston, the Cambridge Innovation Center, CIC, from Kendall Square, right across from MIT. And the Kendall Square story is really, an amazing story. And that's a co-working space and shared office space. And we were the first, Cortex was the first location outside of Kendall Square where the founder of CIC agreed to place the second CIC. And with that also came Venture Cafe, which was a nonprofit that CIC helped stand up in Boston that did a lot of programming, the Thursday Gathering, that in some ways like your morning fill-up, the Thursday Gathering every Thursday afternoon, 48 weeks a year. And we grew that to be one of the largest venture cafes globally, to 400 to 500 people dropping in with 10 to 12 breakout sessions for people to drop in and listen to. So recruiting those three elements, Venture Cafe, CIC, and Wexford Science and Technology, collectively together, focusing on this 200,000 square foot historic building right in the center of the district with a new master plan. That was ground zero. We rolled the dice with that, and bingo, we won. We won. And the second and third building after that came, and we renewed the infrastructure. We put in a rail stop, a light rail stop in the middle of Cortex. The light rail went through Cortex, but there was no station there. So we were able to work over many years to get $13 million to put that rail stop in. So it was building one thing upon another upon another. In some ways, we had to build it and risk it, but we had people who understood it and understood the importance of creating the environment in which these collisions that I talked about could happen. And the excitement was there. I mean, people, when you came in then to Cortex, the district, people knew you were in someplace different. We had different street furniture, different lighting. We put in a 3.5 acre park in the middle of Cortex that was publicly facing, so the public could use it, but also the companies could come out of their buildings and use it. We yoga on the green, music festivals, food trucks on certain days, all that kind of outdoor programming. I mean, we created a sense of place and a destination, and we happened to fortunately, get lucky and recruit what became the number one and still is the number one restaurant in St. Louis called Vicia. It's really an edgy restaurant. And so we had now people coming in from the outside who had nothing to do with Cortex, but wanted to find high cuisine experience. And they would look around and say, wow, what is this place? So it began to advertise itself. So these things built upon themselves. And that's kind of the way there's an organicness to these districts. It takes believers. It takes you have to walk your talk. If you're asking other entrepreneurs to come and join you, you have to be willing to risk too. And My founders put up $30 million of working capital that we managed, that I managed, and Cortex, the nonprofit, managed in a separate account, but we used that and leveraged that for different projects, and kind of rolled it forward, collateralizing as we went.
Mhm.
So all of those things, it's a gumbo, a true gumbo, and you need a lot of players, you need a lot of ingredients, but you also need to believe that you have a roadmap, you know where you're going, you know what you're trying to do, you're trying to leverage all those assets.
Dennis, thanks for sharing that. When you talk about we have to be entrepreneurial as the nonprofit that you are leading has to act entrepreneurial in creating this. It makes me think of Howard Buffett in talking about philanthropy and the idea that philanthropy has such flexibility to try things out as nonprofits, or put resources into something, see if it's working. If it's not working, adjust, and they can do it quicker than for profits because they don't have necessarily stockholders, for example, or different ownership to respond to, as long as you have that base of resource. And I think it's an important point, at least here where we're at, to say that $30 million that you referenced when you started, for all of our listeners, that was in the bank when you retired. And we can talk more about that later, but I understand that you leverage that, use that, and that was important resource, but you also managed it, that was also there for your for the person that comes in after you to
Mm-hmm.
have as a resource. Dennis, you mentioned college,
Mm-hmm.
and I'm curious about your formal training to bring yourself to this work, and how that training and your experience. And you mentioned the two different innovation districts, but your formal training as a Presbyterian minister, um, and community. I would imagine building community in different ways helped prepare you for
How did I
this
get
type of work.
how did that play into all this?
Mm-hmm.
How did I get where I am?
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Fine.
sure, I'd be happy to
Thanks.
kind of give you. So I grew up in a small central Pennsylvania town. Um, uh, my relatives were all farmers. My dad had been a farmer up until the time that I was born. I left the farm, moved to the small city, youngest of four kids, um, and went to Wheaton College in Illinois. Um, and I kind of started out as a conservative Christian in a small evangelical church. Went to Wheaton College, ended up majoring in philosophy. Um, Worked in downtown Chicago on weekends. I say worked; it was a coffee shop that we opened up. Uh, you know, Coffee house, and we sat and talked with people in Old Town in Chicago, and this was late '60s, early '70s,
Oh, wow.
and yeah, and so
We,
it was a time when a lot of ideas were moving in lots of different directions, and there were 10 or 12 of us that ran this on every weekend. It's called the Extension. It was in the basement of a church in Old Town in Chicago. It exposed me to a lot of people, a lot of people's stories, a lot of people passing through at that time. There were a lot of people from the East Coast going to the West Coast, passing through Chicago. Uh, you know, a lot of hippies. It was very, very interesting time, and spent one summer then in the city, running full time. We ran the coffee house, and came across even more people, and came across runaways, a lot of runaways, and we helped get them established and put in places that were reconnecting. One of those summers at college, I then went and spent a summer abroad. I went to Indonesia, and I worked with a Canadian missionary. And this was 1970, so in the middle of the war.
Wow.
And I taught English and gave Bible studies in English. But that cross-cultural experience that I had was just, I've unpacked that for the rest of my life. To be able to see other people's faith, other people's religion, what true poverty was like, and then also at the end of the summer visited my cousin in Bangkok, Thailand, who was flying air cover in a fighter jet for our bombers in Laos and Cambodia. And I said, no, you're not. I mean, my president and my Secretary of Defense tells me that we're not doing anything in Cambodia and Laos. And he said, well, you're not getting the right story. It was a whole summer that just opened up my mind, and I began to come of age. At the time I was 19 years old. And I began to see things from a very different cultural perspective all around. So when I came back, I had culture shock coming back to the United States and looking around and seeing, wow, we're very isolated, we're very insulated. And that then began a journey for me. When I decided I was going to go to seminary, I did. And I ended up doing a traditional pulpit ministry for a period of time in Roxbury, Massachusetts, a minority neighborhood of Boston. Half time, and the other half time working with housing in the Back Bay neighborhood in converting some brownstones to shared intergenerational housing, young and old united, bringing them together. College students that could help older folks get to appointments and shopping, and having the wisdom of older folks shared with the young college green students, like I had been. And that then came, there was an offer that came from that, from a mentor of mine, Maggie Kuhn, who founded the Gray Panthers. She was head of social justice for the Presbyterian Church of America back at that time. And she said, why don't you come down and do this intergenerational housing in Philadelphia and set up a national shared housing resource center? And I said, I'll do that. Because it was community engagement. And so did that for 8 years, and then a couple of one other step before I started working and putting my first innovation district together. But the evolution of my faith journey and my commitment to building community for me was natural. I had personally answered some theological questions for myself, and decided that I didn't just want to spend the rest of my life in a pulpit, being an apologist for the vision and the truth that I saw. I felt I could do more by engaging with the community, and that was the path that I then followed. So it was a circuitous path, but it made sense to me.
And you started off this conversation talking about helping people see what they're able to do. And it seems as there's so much of that throughout the formal roles and informal that you've just described.
Yeah, and that's exactly right. And I mean, we have to all remember that we have our individual stories, and we all have our individual perspectives, and it's all informed by our experiences that we have. And so in innovation districts, where you're bringing together a lot of people with different perspectives and different ideas, I mean, my last project before I left, Cortex, was not yet fulfilled because the pandemic happened. But we built this garage. We were in the process of about to start a second garage that was attached to it. And across the back of that garage facing the interstate highway, and facing the rail, light rail that ran right next to it. We had commissioned a mural that from a studio in Florida, and the mural was going to be two parts. The first building, because the second building wasn't built, it was going to say "We can."
Mm-hmm.
And when we finished the garage, the second part of the mural was going to be up there: "Change the world."
Mm-hmm.
We can change the world, and that is the mantra of what innovation districts are about. I remember in 2010 when I was recruiting CIC to Boston, the founder of CIC, Tim Rowe, we were having a conversation over coffee, and I said to him, why are you doing this? What motivates you? And he said, I believe that technology and the people behind it can change the world. And he said, the people that we put in these shared co-working spaces want to change the world as well. And I thought at the time, that's pretty lofty ambition.
Mm-hmm.
But over the 10 years, when I saw the entrepreneurs and startup companies coming in and the enthusiasm they had, not all successful, obviously. You strike matches, some of them light, okay?
Mm-hmm.
But universally, you ask a lot of those people that were sitting in those chairs and a lot of under 30s, why are you doing this? Many times they'd say, because I want to change the world. And they would look at me and say, look at the world you left me. Somebody's got to do something about it. I want to do something about it. So that's kind of, yes, that connection, creating opportunities for people to make their contributions. That's what innovation districts are about.
So as you saw things in people and you saw the space and what it could be, Cortex grew from two structures into what would be the 60-second description of how many buildings is this? How many residents are living in these mixed use and using these? It grew when you left in 2020 into what?
Well, we had about 6,300 employees that were in the district when I left.
How many employees, how many of those worked for you directly versus when you say 6,300, I just want to make clear that's all the businesses and everything. How many did you have in your operation?
On my staff? Okay.
Yeah, running this.
On my staff, we had, at the time I left, we had 12 on my staff at that time. When I came in 2010, I was the first staff person. Up to that point, the board ran the operation. The chairman was the one that kind of oversaw day-to-day stuff. And there was an assistant that he had. So I was the first hired full-time employee. I hired two other individuals at the time. When I came, I hired an administrative secretary, and I also hired a lawyer who had financial background that could help on both the financing side as well as the legal side. And then over the decade, we grew from those 3 to 12 when I left. And since that time, there have been another 4 that have been added under the new leadership that came in. But it was organic growth based on the needs of the district.
And the district's size is 200 acres.
Mm-hmm.
And I apologize, I interrupted you. And so in 2020, 6,300 people were employed.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and there was one condominium rehab that was in the district with 84 units, and that was a historic rehab of an old Ford motor plant. And we had approved a 200, I think about 200 person or 200 apartment unit building, 200 unit apartment building with mixed retail on the first floor, and that was about to be kicked off. The pause button was hit on that because of COVID, but that would have the whole idea of wanting to introduce more residents in the district was to create more security on the ground and to make it a 24/7 environment, a true live, work, play environment. And there was another residential building which we had approved with an office tech building that was just on the other side of the railroad tracks in a new sector of that 200 acres. So those were all teed up and ready to go. But currently only one of those residential projects is in the district. But on this immediately to the south of the 200 acres and immediately to the north of the 200 acres are very vibrant residential neighborhoods with amenities in them, restaurants and all the things that you would find in a urban neighborhood. So, and a lot of the employees lived in those neighborhoods and came into work. But we were constantly trying to create a car optional environment, a walkable environment. And by putting more residential, the plan is by putting more residential in the district, you give that option to people. Do you want to just live in the district and then walk across the street to go to work? And also, we wanted to make a portion and required that a portion of those two new buildings be workforce housing, approximately 20% or so, 25% workforce housing, because the institutions on either end of us that were bookended had a lot of positions for support that having the ability for people to live there and be able to walk to those locations, because transportation is challenging for people of lesser means. So that was part of the vision too.
Dennis, you mentioned, thanks for doing that summary. And you mentioned security, and that one of the reasons to have residents there and have 24-hour activity for security. Can you talk a little bit about that mindset? I really appreciate that.
Yeah. So a 24/7 environment does, several things. I mentioned, provide the opportunity for people to live in the district where they're working. It provides security in the district because you've got people out walking in the district. At the end of the day, if they're families, they're pushing little kids in strollers. We had a 3.5 acre park, so you can go out and hang out there and have fun. But it also activates the restaurant and retail components in the district. It's very hard to sustain retail in an innovation district if at 5 o'clock everybody leaves the district and goes home. Restaurants usually cannot survive on lunchtime traffic. They need a dinner service as well. And so by having more residential units in the district, you're creating that opportunity, for those restaurants to fill those seats in the evening. Otherwise, you need premier destination restaurants, which we were very fortunate. I mentioned with Vicia, it was a destination. People were coming in from the county and still are, and it's now expanding. That restaurant is expanding out onto the green that we created that park. So that mixed use of introducing residents has multiple benefits for the district. And at first, I can say that, the first model, the first master plan said, no, we're not going to have any amenities because the neighborhoods have all the amenities and they have the housing. So let's just build this business environment. And it took some convincing of my board, some of my board members, not all, but some of my board members, that no, we need a mixed use. This needs to be live, work, play. And we added learn to it as well, live, work, play, learn, because of our academic institutions. And, we now, there are courses that are taught in the district. The master's program in cybersecurity that Washington University runs is now, those classes are taught in the district because we're standing up a center of the Global Center for Cybersecurity. And Washington University is part of that, as well as a lot of corporations. But they're putting their training, their coursework for their graduate students in cybersecurity. Those are being taught in the district. So live, work, play, learn. Again, it's bringing students into the district. It's exposing them. It's giving them opportunities to interact and work together.
Thanks, Dennis. In a minute or so, can you help us understand this transition that's occurred since the Industrial Revolution, actually before, right, where we did live, work, socialize, play, learn. We did all those things in a certain region, location that's walkable for a lot of practical reasons. One, cars didn't exist to and are readily available. And then the switch to, can you walk us through that?
Yeah.
The last 100 years in a minute or two?
Yeah, I was living back then, so I understand. Yes, so this change to the out-migration of the urban areas, and particularly the older industrial areas, happened primarily post-World War II. And, I lived in Philly for quite a few years. It's a great town. It was a factory town. It had a river running through it. And along that river, there were factories. And the workers in those factories lived immediately adjacent in the neighborhoods that's cropped up around them. And those workers that worked in those factories walked to work in the mornings. And, for the reasons that you articulated, the time, not everybody had cars or had the money to have a car. And post-World War II, when the interstate highway system was developed, coming out of the Defense Department, it was actually a Defense Department initiated effort to try to spread out the defense resources across the country so they wouldn't be so vulnerable being all in one urban location or a few urban locations. And so the interstate highway system was developed. And with the interstate highway system developing, then it allowed people to move to the suburbs, and the suburbs began to be created. And then people needed cars to get into the city. And then companies started building businesses in the suburbs so they didn't have to come into the city. Mm-hmm. So all of these things began to interact. In some cities, it was positive. In some cities, it was negative. And then, ironically, what has happened with the millennial generation and now the Z generation is much more of a desire to return to the city. And that is a big part of the impetus for developing innovation districts and creating environments to work in the city where a lot of millennials and Zs want to live, to be close to the entertainment, car optional again. I mean, it's kind of interesting. What goes around comes around. So all these things are enabling components for innovation districts.
Thanks, Dennis. You mentioned a mentor a few minutes ago. Will you talk about the importance of mentors? We've got some wonderful examples here in Rapid City, of mentors that are working with startups that have become very successful very quickly. But would you talk about a mentor maybe in your life that's been mm-hmm. instrumental, and then the importance of mentors in general?
Yeah. So I talked about earlier about experience. We all have, our life is the collection of our experiences.
Mm,
And I thought about this. You'd mentioned to me that I should reflect on this a little bit. And there are two people in my life, both women, um, uh, one in college, Beatrice Batson. She was the professor of English and was the head of the Department of English at the university I went to. And then Maggie Kuhn, who was the social justice director for the Presbyterian Church of America. For different reasons, they left an impression, lifelong impression on me. Dr. Batson, I still see her standing in front of the class. I took a Russian literature class with her, Russian Romantic literature. And she was so filled with passion, as Russian literature is, standing in front of us, waving her arms, looking upward, uh, you know, talking about the vitality of life. I mean, she just infused enthusiasm in you and a positive attitude that you needed to reach out and seize life. Um, that that lesson kind of stuck with me. I wasn't always aware of it, but it was there. It was behind me. It was with me. And then when I graduated from seminary and was starting my, to do some pulpit ministry, I was introduced to Maggie Kuhn, who really was focusing at that time on, and she became radicalized when she was forced to retire from the Presbyterian Church at the age of 65. And she said, "What's this? We're warehousing our older people. Just because there's an age number now associated with me doesn't mean I'm not relevant anymore." And she founded the Gray Panthers. And it was all about the relevancy and importance of aging and the wisdom that an older person has and how important it is to capture that. And one of the things that she focused on was creating intergenerational housing. And she was the one that invited me to go to Philadelphia to start this National Shared Housing Resource Center, long before there were computer matchup programs or any of that stuff. That's what we were doing in the basement of her house. She said, "Come and I'll be on your board, and we'll start this thing." And we consulted in 20 different states to create intergenerational shared housing and matchup programs to use the assets of older people that had larger, older homes that were empty nesters, and to have college students and younger folks move in, and that service exchange that was there and helping each other. So she was a big mentor in my life of facilitating community and the importance of connecting people up in a disconnected world, and not just warehousing people, and letting everybody's contribution to rise up and happen. She was an enabler, and that stuck with me.
Thanks, Dennis.
Yeah, and I guess just quickly segue to the tech side of it. It's so important. And a lot of our larger companies now that have taken space in Cortex are mentoring some of the younger companies for two reasons. They might end up licensing the technology or buying the company, but they also see it as a civic responsibility, to bring the next generation along and in mentoring them. And so a lot of mentorship goes on in the programming that happens. One of the things we always did before we had to stop doing the in-person meetings was office hours. And those would be CEOs of larger corporations or senior people that would sit down, and you could sign up and make an appointment for 45 minutes or an hour to sit down during that Thursday afternoon gathering, to sit at a table and say, "Hey, I got this problem. Do you have a suggestion of how I can, get myself unstuck here?" So yeah, mentoring is very, very important.
Dennis, what do you think the most important characteristic of a leader is?
Um, there's not one, but I think humility, um, burying your ego, burying, Burying. Um, there are too many people that are leaders for the wrong reasons. It's self-aggrandizement, and I just don't think that that's the way to lead. I think the way to lead is, and it kind of goes back to my background of being a servant leader in a sense.
Mhm.
You're there to serve people and to facilitate. And so I think having somebody that has compassion, is a facilitator, um, that tries to facilitate collaboration. You can't do this on your own. You need takes a village,
Mhm.
and good leaders are people that bring people together. So those are important characteristics from my perspective, to help people maximize their potential. That's what a leader should do, because a leader can't do it him or herself.
Mhm.
Um, there are far, 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 far more smarter people and many more smarter people than I am. That's not my role to be the smartest person on the block. So
So, Dennis, there's a skill that exists to be able to bring all different types of leaders and their level of intelligence to the table to work in a unified direction. What's that skill? How would you describe that skill that you have,
yeah,
obviously?
well, I think it's that old hackneyed phrase, win-win.
Mm.
Um, Leaders need to find ways where everybody can get what they need. So, yeah, I just painted a really rosy picture of what leadership is, kumbaya, but it ain't kumbaya all the time, and many times not even most of the time.
Mm.
So you have to sit across the table from people and negotiate, and you have to understand, you have to be a good negotiator,
Mm.
um, because there are different people are motivated for different reasons, uh, in business. Some are single bottom line, some are double bottom line, some are triple bottom line. Um, so you have to find common ground. And when a leader is sitting at a table, and I would always negotiate my own deals, even though I had staff,
Mhm.
because I felt it was really important to be in the public and to be front and center with these deals, so that I could really keep my finger on the pulse of what the issues were within the district, what was important to the companies, and try to find ways to get across the river together.
Mm.
So the easy thing is, let's find out what we all agree on, and let's agree on those, and then set them aside. And when we would hit a road bump, on an issue we couldn't agree on, let's set that aside.
Mhm.
Let's get all the stuff, the common stuff that we can agree on done. It makes it so much easier than in negotiations
Mhm.
to get across those final, jump from rock to rock to get to the other side. Once Because now you're invested. Now the person across the table from you is invested. They want to also get to the other side,
Mhm.
and so, um, you have a good leader has to also recognize that he or she does not have the corner on intelligence and doesn't know the truth. It's their version of truth, but it's not the truth. And so we all have proximate truth, and we all learn from each other, and we all need to be enlightened from each other. So that, a good leader recognizes that.
Dennis, we have about a minute left. I have two questions. One has come in from one of our Rapid City Council persons, and he would like to know a little bit more about the sustainability of an innovation district and how that
Mhm,
happens. I know that's not totally
mhm,
unfair to throw that out there to you and
mhm.
for the 30 seconds, but 30 seconds on that.
Okay. Yeah, so there are a couple different ways to go about that. We used a square footage assessment on all new buildings that were being built or buildings that were being rehabbed, and that square footage assessment was charged on an annual basis. and it was tiered for office and lab, residential, retail was declining,
Got
with an annual escalator, 2.5%. That's one way. Another way is through a bid
it. Mhm.
or a CID, where you have sort of an additional leverage, levy of some percent of sales tax that then comes into the governing organization to continue its work. So there are different ways to go about and do it.
Thanks, Dennis. I think
Oh, and
the
pardon,
no.
two other quick ways.
Mhm.
If you own the buildings, some of the buildings, not all of them, because you don't want to be in the landlord business. But if you own some of the buildings, you're generating rents, and some of the excess that's not necessarily for debt service can come into the organization to help the staffing needs, operational needs. And the other thing is that our strategy was that we wanted to build and control the parking and the excess parking revenue. And we wanted to do that because that way we could shift parking resources around from building to building depending on need, so that a developer didn't have to build a standalone or a parking resource just for that building. So the excess revenues from those rents in both cases of buildings that we owned and also parking structures that helped to float the boat. And one final thing was that land that we own, we entered into long-term ground leases.
Oh.
And those long-term ground leases, 65 to 99-year ground leases, threw off money back to the
Mhm.
organization. Now you had to make the initial investment to buy the land up front, but there's some margin in there as well. So a variety of different ways to piece margin together to be able to support the operations and sustain the organization.
Dennis, that just reminds me of your comment earlier. You have to be entrepreneurial. And I just think of the things that you just shared on revenue streams. I mean, there's some pretty creative ways in there, and using the assets that you have at your disposal. So two more quick questions. You must be an avid reader. Is there a book that you recommend? What book would you recommend throughout that you've read that you?
Well, right now, what I've been doing is writing haikus for myself. So less reading, more haikus. So there is one book that was published back in 2012 that relates to innovation districts in a way. It's called The New Geography of Jobs, and you probably have heard of it by Enrico Moretti. And that book talks about what has happened with jobs in America and the flight to tech jobs and the challenge that cities have in capturing those. I don't agree with everything that's in the book. One of my major critiques is that a lot of folks feel like unless you are a San Francisco, a San Diego, a Boston, an Atlanta, an Austin, that you can't compete, and I don't agree with that. I think every region, every city has assets. You've got to figure out what are the assets that you can leverage, and you have to be realistic. And it's not success, yes or no. You're not going to build the next Silicon Valley in Rapid City, and I never use those terms of, in St. Louis, we weren't trying to build a Boston. We weren't trying to build, a San Francisco or a San Diego. We were trying to build St. Louis.
Yes.
And that's what you have to focus on. So,
yeah.
But this book raises a lot of issues around technology, economic development issues. But it's not the gospel, but it's one that you might take a look at.
Thanks, Dennis. Last question, I promise. What's the best piece of advice you've been given?
So just to be a little indelicate, I went into a restroom in a co-working space last week. And when I was washing my hands, I looked up on the wall, and there was this poster of affirmations, all strung together, in a train of thought, and all in one color except two words. Two words were in a different color, and they appeared at different places in that poster. And the words that popped out were "Be you, be you." And so I think personally, that's what life is about. Be you, find yourself, find your purpose, climb your mountain. Everybody has a mountain, their own mountain to climb. Figure out how to get to the top of it. Be you. And every innovation district needs to be itself. You need not to be looking to emulate. You need to be looking to differentiate.
Dennis, thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate
My
this
pleasure.
conversation and yesterday and over the last couple months. I hope it works sometime that you're able to travel this way and see what's going on in the Black Hills and just join us here in this region. It would be really, really fun to walk
That
around
would
the
be
streets
nice.
here.
Look forward to that.
Have a wonderful rest of the day and
Thank you.
and week. Thanks, Dennis, and thanks everybody for joining us. Have a great rest of the week.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.